Welcome to today's episode of the Coach's Corner. I'm Melanie Bronson. It's great to have you with us. Today we're focused on Dartmouth College. Dartmouth is a private Ivy League institution located in Hanover, New Hampshire. It is one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in the United States, and it is known for having a strong emphasis on undergraduate liberal arts education alongside professional schools in business, engineering, and medicine. Dartmouth is home to roughly 4,000 undergraduate students and another 3,000 graduate students, coming up with a total of about 7,000 students total. Athletically, Dartmouth competes in the NCAA Division One as part of the Ivy League. Its rugby program for the men is part of the NCR Division One. And for the women, part of the NCAA developing sports called NYRA in the Division One section. The rugby programs at Dartmouth are a prominent part of the campus sports culture. The men's rugby team dates back to 1951 and has a long history of national competitiveness, including multiple appearances in the national championship tournaments. The women's team is also highly successful and is frequently ranked among the top programs nationally and known for producing elite players who go on to compete at higher levels, including the international level. Today, I'm delighted to have with me the men's head coach, and that is Coach Kyle Sumsion. Welcome, Coach Sumsion.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks, Melanie.
Now, let's dive right in. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you found yourself at Dartmouth?
I guess in the US, rugby's getting more and more popular and prominent, but I found it later in life, like a lot do here. So I started playing in my senior year, my last year of high school. But like everybody else, immediately fell in love with the oval shaped ball, and since then been chasing that ball around everywhere here. After playing, my last year, I went and played at BYU. Won 5 national championships with them. Was an All-American every year. Played for the U.S. national team. And then went and played for the MLR, which is the Major League Rugby, the professional league in the States for a number of years as well here. As my playing career started to come to an end, I started getting into coaching and have absolutely loved it. So I started coaching really at West Point, which is where I, kind of cut my teeth, which is the U.S. Military Academy. And it was there for 4 years. While doing that, I was the head coach of the U.S. under 20s, and then the assistant coach for the U.S. under 18s. And am now at Dartmouth, and in my 4th year at Dartmouth and absolutely loving it.
That's fantastic. It's not many sports where you can join that late in life and have it have such an incredible impact on your life and be so successful.
Yeah, no, it's certainly the case here. I absolutely love rugby, everything about it. But I think my favorite part about the sport is the camaraderie, the brotherhood on the men's side, the sisterhood on the women's. It just brings people together, and there's so many great, incredible attributes that you get out of the sport that are such a benefit, not only during those 80 minutes, but for life. Which is a big reason why I love coaching as well, is because it's more than just the game of rugby. It's about developing leaders and developing men, which we'll obviously get more into about Dartmouth and how that plays into our culture.
That is the perfect introduction. Can you tell us about the Dartmouth rugby program?
Yeah, so Dartmouth rugby's been around we're going into our 75th year. So it's a, storied program, and as you mentioned, it's had a lot of success. We just recently made the finalists in the national championship for sevens, where we unfortunately lost, took second in the nation. But the team's been very successful in both 15s and sevens over that period of time. The 75 years here. But I think what makes Dartmouth, so much more successful and impactful is if you look at the graduates, the things that they go on to do, they literally go on to change the world, which is so exciting. Dartmouth is an Ivy League institution. And so it is very challenging to get to Dartmouth, but you know, the caliber of young men that play on the rugby team, are highly successful academically, and you pair that with the lessons, the learnings from the rugby program, and it shapes them to be better men, better leaders, better everything, husbands, fathers, so on and so forth here. And so It's a very special group. There's 80 plus guys on the rugby team. We filled three teams. It's a meritocracy, so the best players play. Doesn't matter if you're a freshman or a senior, or you've been playing for 1 week or 15 years. So every year we'll have guys come in, that will light the world on fire as freshmen. A couple, starting for us there. So it's great. Every week, we'll field three teams, as I said. So no one practices to practice, Melanie. Everyone practices to play. So um, a big part of it is making sure we have ample opportunities for everyone to get training in, but really get games in here. So we have three full-time coaches for 15s. So every team is getting looked after. We have a full-time strength and conditioning coach, and we have a full-time athletic trainer. That making sure that we're held together and we're at our best every week here. So in the U.S. landscape, we are so fortunate. Just those resources as far as personnel is very unique. But we also have, three rugby specific pitches, that are just used by the men's and the women's rugby team. We have our own clubhouse, our own facilities. We utilize all of the varsity weight rooms, the indoor practice facilities when we get buried in snow in the Northeast. Again, just very fortunate to have, the facilities and the infrastructure that we have to be successful here because our goal is to be the best team in the country, full stop. And so we make no, excuses about that. And so we have all the resources that we need in order to compete at the highest level.
So, one of the challenges that teams with large rosters often face is finding opposition with large rosters. And so sometimes there's an issue with the third side not getting a game. How do you combat that at Dartmouth?
Yeah, we're so fortunate, I guess, where we're located in the Northeast. There's so many teams around us, and so typically what that means is that every time we play a game in our conference, we'll play a first and a second side. So when we play Harvard, when we play Brown, when we play an AIC, they're always going to bring two teams. But typically they won't have enough every team to fill the third side team. So we'll go out and find a team that just wants to play our developmental team, our third side, against their first side, and so we'll usually go down to Division two, Division three, a lower division where they're looking for meaningful games and strong opposition, and so it's great for us and it works out great for them. And typically that game might be on a Wednesday, a midweek game versus a Saturday. So we're just trying to find creative ways to make sure we have games because, as I said, everyone you practice to play, and that's where you're going to get better with film and all of that as well.
Terrific. So I mentioned earlier that the men's team is in the NCR Division One. Can you explain what that means, who you compete against, and where you stand in the lineup?
Yeah, so we finished this year eighth in the country. So very competitive. Our goal is obviously to be number one. But very competitive nonetheless here. So in our conference, we play against Brown, Siena, AIC, Fairfield, Fordham, Dartmouth. Make up the six teams right now in our conference here. So we'll also play, friendlies. So our goal this year is that we'll get a game against Notre Dame, a game against UCLA, a game against McGill, which is a university in Canada. So our goal is to make sure that we're playing 8 to 10 quality, in-season games before we get to postseason there. So each of our games are about 2 hours typically, one way. So they're all within, day trips for the most part here. So, which is great. So we'll either host or we'll travel, to and from in the day to play, a big competition here. So, that's our conference. Once we get outside of that conference, the league, the as you said, the NCR is quite a bit bigger here. So there's teams out of Oklahoma, out of Texas, out of California, all the way, upstate New York. And so, once you get outside of the conference, then you get into playoffs there. So where conferences will pair up with other conferences. So last year, in the first round of the playoffs, we played against Wheeling, which is a team out of West Virginia. But that'll always, I guess, ebb and flow based on the success of the teams each year.
Great. When does your season start and end? And do you play 15s? Do you play sevens? And what do you do in the off season?
Yeah, so In the NCR, but specifically Dartmouth as well, we do fall 15s and spring sevens. So we'll put together in the fall, there's three teams playing in 15s. In the spring, there's two teams playing, sevens and one team playing 15s there. So there's not enough sevens games to go around in the spring, but there's also the body type for everybody isn't always sevens as well there. So we make sure that again everyone's playing meaningful rugby year round, but we play our autumn 15s and our spring sevens. Um, what that looks like for us is that we start a preseason August 25th this year, but school won't start until the 14th of September. So it'll be 3 weeks of just rugby, double days every day, getting ready for the regular season once academics start there. And then we're playing through the middle of December for the 15s championship, which is the goal there.
So, how do you keep your non-sevens players engaged in the spring?
Yeah, they're playing 15s. Um, so they're still competing and playing games. So everyone has their rugby. While there's slightly different tracks. There's only one name on the trophy, whether it's 15s or sevens, the Dartmouth rugby team. So everyone has a goal, of making sure that they're getting better and improving and winning meaningful games.
Terrific. What does your typical week look like? When do your players go to class? When do they train, lift? You mentioned the games are on Saturdays and potentially Wednesdays, but draw me a picture of an ordinary week.
Yeah, an ordinary week for us is that the students will have classes basically between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. They don't have classes during that entire block, but they would sign up for their classes during that window. And so for a Dartmouth student full time is that three courses because we're on the quarter system, which I can talk more about later. And so a typical week for us, though, means that we'll start training after the academic day is done, which is typically around 4 p.m. So training will start at 4:30, but as we go through the week, on a Monday, we just got done playing a game on a Saturday. And so on Monday is a big recovery day for us. So we'll get a lift in, a recovery lift, but we'll also, excuse me, break down film. And so we'll look at the learnings and the lessons from the game that we just had, and we'll also look at the upcoming opposition for the things and the learnings that we need to have in place for them. On a Tuesday, that'll be our most I guess competitive, our highest impact day here. So for us, a Tuesday should always be our heaviest day as far as workload, and it should be harder than a Saturday. So we want to put maximum pressure on us on a Tuesday so that we can apply maximum pressure on the opposition on a Saturday here. So a Wednesday, we'll get a second lift. We'll get out, we'll debrief some of the film that took place on the Tuesday as well. And then Thursday's our speed day, so we'll spend a lot of time on transitions, on territory, on units. But it's our speed day, so it's, high velocity with longer breaks in between. And then Friday's our captain's run. So, we try to fix, everything that needs to be done, and then, just kind of get the clarity and the confidence ahead of taking souls again on a Saturday.
You mentioned taking souls on the Saturday gave me a chuckle. You mentioned that Dartmouth operates on a quarter system. That's quite unique. There aren't many schools that do that. Can you explain what that means? And also, you do a very unique thing sophomore year. So could you touch on that?
Yeah, so the way the quarter system works is that you choose as a student which 3 quarters you want to enroll in and which 1 quarter you want to take off. And so the quarters align with the season. So you have your autumn, your winter, your spring, and your summer. Almost everybody will take off their summer quarter because that's when the weather's nice. All their friends are off at other universities and schools. And they'll travel, they'll work internships, they'll work jobs, so on and so forth. A full-time course schedule is 3 classes, as I said, as well, and that's because each quarter is 10 weeks long. So they're sprints. So they're very short, and they pack a lot into those 10 weeks of those 3 classes there. But when you're a rising junior, so your sophomore summer, as you mentioned, you have to go to school during your sophomore summer, which will then free up your fall, your winter, your spring. And the reason why Dartmouth does that, even though you're coming from an Ivy League institution, when you apply for an internship, you're still competing against all the other, high academic quality students across the world. So you're talking about Oxford, Cambridge, MIT, Harvard, Yale, UCLA, Cal Berkeley, Stanford, so on and so forth. And so they're very competitive, obviously, to get into those top internships. But when you apply for an internship in the winter, you're competing against really nobody. And so it gives them such an opportunity and a leg up to get those top internships, during, I guess, what would be considered the off season of internships, which would then give them the experience or the opportunity to get a job outright from that as they apply for, maybe their next one, their junior summer. And so that's the reason why Dartmouth has that. It's called the Dartmouth D plan. And it's all geared up to make sure that you have the most opportunities as an undergrad to land the top internships, which will lead to the top jobs, once you graduate.
And people typically use the winter term for those internships because it aligns with that natural break in the rugby season. Is that right?
Yeah, the rugby team, where it is possible, they'll typically try to go the winter term, because it does, give us a better. We're competing in the fall and in the spring, and the winter is, a bit more free time, but less rugby actually competition.
Okay. So do you have international players on your team and what is their role on the team?
Yeah, so we do, and they come from all over the world. I think that's what makes Dartmouth so unique and so special is that, we have players from England, from the UK, from New Zealand, from South Africa, from Australia, from Hong Kong, Philippines, Guam, again, just all over the world, and that is, I guess, such an incredible part about Dartmouth, is that you bring people from all over the world, but also on the rugby team, so we get to blend all these different playing styles, from Argentina to, Southern, Northern Hemisphere rugby as well. Um, their role on the team, is, I guess, the same as everybody else's, by and large, outside of the fact that typically an international student, when they walk on or join the team, they have more rugby experience than potentially an American kid, that, picked up a rugby ball for the first time, maybe at Dartmouth, and so in a lot of ways, we talk about at Dartmouth that the best coaching is peer to peer. That's the very best coaching where they can get immediate feedback from, one of their teammates, that maybe, one of the coaches missed because there's, one coach for, or three coaches, excuse me, for 80 players. And so they bring that level of knowledge, that level of experience, in where they can help, almost be another, set of eyes, another coach that can help, build the team and, get to the fastest, best outcome as quickly as possible, so that's really what it looks like for us, on our team, as I mentioned, 80 players, about 60% of them picked up a rugby ball though when they walked on, to the team at Dartmouth, so the first time they even saw a rugby ball or rugby match was at Dartmouth, so that 40%, typically, a bunch of them are from the US as well, but typically they would come from the likes of the UK, or international population.
Right. Um, Dartmouth is the way you explained it, it's different than a lot of the other Ivy League schools. Could you tell me about how Dartmouth sets itself apart and essentially why someone should choose Dartmouth over other Ivies and other rugby teams?
Yeah, that's great. So obviously a bit biased here, Melanie, but Dartmouth is the single greatest, rugby program in the world. Not even in the Ivies, not even in the U.S., just the world here. So, and I think what makes it so unique is there's a few things, that make Dartmouth unique. But when I talk about us being unique, specifically us compared to the other Ivies, is what I guess I'm going to refer to right now. So one is where we're located. Our slogan is "Welcome to the Woods." Dartmouth is located, in the woods, and so, which is great, for someone that's, loves the outdoors, that wants to be in that environment. During the winter, we get a lot of snow, which again, you don't come to Dartmouth to hibernate and hide in the winter. You come here to embrace the season, the elements, So Dartmouth has its own skiway, so during the winter, the entire student body population, including the rugby players, are all skiing and snowboarding. They're hiking, they're swimming, they're fishing, they're doing just every outdoors thing you can think of, during their 4 years here at Dartmouth, but that is very unique. All the other Ivies are in big, cities, so you have Boston for Harvard, you have Columbia for New York City, so on and so forth, So that is a part that's unique. Dartmouth is also the only one that is on the quarter system that sets you up, for that, internship in the fall, the winter, the spring by giving you, some summer academics, and so those are probably things that are a bit more unique about Dartmouth, outside the rugby program. I think inside the rugby program, I think the one thing that makes Dartmouth, really unique is, I guess the way we look at rugby is that when you join the rugby team, you make commitment to the team, and that commitment is it means that you are doing everything in your power to make sure you can honor that commitment. So that means that you have to be very academically and time management on point, and so, we do not have players missing because they have to write a paper, because they knew that they had to write a paper 3 weeks ago. And so they're working hard during that 3 weeks to make sure it's done on time. And they're not waiting till the last minute and saying, "Hey, coach, I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to be able to join training today because I have a paper that's due in 2 hours," And so, we really prioritize, you honoring both commitments. You're honoring your academic commitment, you're honoring your rugby commitment here. And so for us, that's about real world behaviors. At the end of the day, when you graduate and you get a job, you can't tell your boss that, I'll get you that paper, that presentation done, in a couple days after it's due because I was up all night playing Call of Duty, Fortnite, or watching Netflix here. So we want to make sure that, the product that we're putting, the end product, excuse me, is, the best representation of yourself, and that means that you're having to time manage, you're having to work hard early to have success, and that you're not sacrificing your commitment to the rugby team because you've procrastinated on the front end there. So, I think our vision, Melanie, on the rugby team is the world is a better place with a Dartmouth rugby player in it. That's our vision, is that at the end of the day, rugby matters and winning matters because that's how we're going to produce, the best type of individual. But the reality is, as I said, that, you're probably not going to go change the world once you're done with rugby by doing it inside of rugby, And so, again, we've had great players go on to do incredible things in rugby. Masson Hughes, who went to Wellington over in the UK, but his parents were, American. He captained two of the Olympic sides for sevens for the US. He played in 3 Olympics. He's done great things for rugby, but the majority of them are going to go change the world outside of rugby, whether that's business, philanthropy, engineering, medicine, so on and so forth here. And for us, that's what we're trying to build is the best end product possible that they're going to be able to take the lessons, the values, the learnings from the great sport of rugby to literally change the world. And there's no better place than Dartmouth or an Ivy League education to set you up with all those tools that you need in order to make a massive impact, during your 4 years, obviously at Dartmouth, but then beyond as well.
That's great. There are two components that go into choosing ultimately being able to go to a certain college. First, you have to get in, and secondly, you have to be able to afford it. So, could you tell us about the academic requirements to gain admissions to Dartmouth, and then also how scholarships or financial aid work at Dartmouth?
Yeah. So Dartmouth, so the rugby team is incredible, but there's and we have every resource we need, as I mentioned, to be, one of the top, if not the top program in the country, as our ultimate mission is to be national champions. But we are a club sport, and so the one thing that keeps us as a club sport outside of the varsity realm is that we do not have admission slots. And what I mean by slots is that I cannot go to somebody and say, "Hey, you're the type of player we want, and I can guarantee you admissions into the school." And so, in order to apply to Dartmouth, you need to do exceptionally well academically, And so, what that looks like is that you're a 4.0 student or a 4.0 equivalent. So, if you're looking at, I guess the UK, that's A's and A stars, that's what you need to be achieving in your A levels. If you're looking at your GCSEs, you're 39s and above on your GCSEs, so you are performing at the highest level and you're taking challenging courses, at the same time here. So you cannot take basket weaving like I did in high school and, get A's in it and expect to get into an Ivy League institution here. So on top of that, it is highly recommended for the UK population that you apply with an SAT or an ACT. So what that looks like, the average last year for the ACT was a 33, and the average last year for the SAT was a 1480. Now again, there's other ways, you don't have to have it from the UK. You can apply with just your predicted A levels, but it is another set of data that helps you so much if you get the results you need on the SAT, ACT. So we would always encourage that you apply with that, and that you study and you take that test there. So that's how you get in. You have to meet that academic criteria, but that's how you really, get your application opened, so to speak here. Um, Dartmouth is looking for people that are going to contribute on campus. They don't want somebody that's going to spend 120 hours a week in the library, and they're not going to have meaningful, relationships, and they're not going to make the campus a better place. And so, on top of, getting your really strong academics, they want to look at you as a whole person, so sports will be a big part of that, right? So what leadership, who are you as an athlete? People that are athletes, they've had to obviously have a lot of really great time management skills. They're very dedicated. There's a lot of attributes that go with that, but it's also, what other areas are you interested in? If you're just a student athlete, you're probably not going to get in, to especially for the rugby team, right? Because there's a whole bunch of sports, whether it's the American football, the soccer team, lacrosse, the field hockey, where, they can, they're just looking for, you as a student athlete here, but you need to be able to branch out outside of that. So is it, religious groups? Is it, clubs? Is it, music? Is it theater? What other things are you interested in and passionate about? Is it what philanthropy, have you started a business? So on and so forth. And so all of that goes into your application, and they want to look at you as a whole. And really how you're able to kind of tell your story is through your essays. So essays are so vital and important when applying to a Dartmouth or an Ivy League school, because it's really how you can, let them know who you are and differentiate yourself from the other thousands of applications that get submitted there. So that's how that works. So Dartmouth men's rugby, as I mentioned, we do not have admission slots. However, we do submit what's called a special talent evaluation form to, the admissions here. And what that does is it just says, hey, look, this guy is a great rugby player. He's someone that we've talked to. We think he's going to be a great fit for Dartmouth. He's going to be a great fit for the team. And so we give that to admissions, on behalf of the student. And what that does is it tells the admissions is like, look, it adds value to his application. It does not guarantee anyone admissions, but it gives them another point of data that says, hey, this person's, obviously his application looks great, but he's also going to contribute to the rugby team on campus. And so again, it's another great aspect where we do get to work with the school, and they love the rugby program, they love the rugby team, and they want to see us do well at the same time.
Fantastic. That's really helpful. Now, I mentioned early on in our conversation that there is an incredibly successful women's rugby team at Dartmouth. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, which will be great. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then I'll finish, Melanie, with the I guess your question about financial aid and scholarships here. So, which is great. This will be a good segue into that, though. So, the women's team is amazing. They, as you mentioned at the beginning of the call, they are nationally ranked, if not, number one or number two every year. They are extremely competitive, and we are, as on the men's side, always trying to reach the same accolades that they are. They're also have incredible coaches, incredible players. And we're very fortunate to be associated with them. And so the women's team is varsity though, which is which is great for them. And what varsity means is that, they have all the same resources that the men do as far as full-time coaches, athletic trainers, they utilize all the same facilities, but they do have admission slots, so if the women's program wants you, they can essentially guarantee you admissions as long as you meet the academic criteria. And that academic criteria, again, it's not my world, so I'm not exactly sure what it looks like, but I know they have a little bit more leverage than, I guess the general population might when applying as well. Um, but one thing that's unique about Dartmouth, and the Ivies is that nobody is on a scholarship. No one's on an academic scholarship because everyone would be on an academic scholarship, and no one is on an athletic scholarship. So everybody that goes to Dartmouth, is eligible for financial aid, though. And Dartmouth is needs blind international. So when you apply internationally, they are not, they're looking at you just like they would anybody else from the US or, well, yeah, I guess from the US in that context there. So what that means is that financial aid is saying, hey, we will make sure that nobody chooses not to come to Dartmouth because they cannot financially afford it. And so you'll have to do some math on your guys' end here, but if you make 125,000 US dollars or the equivalent or less as a family household, you would go to school and you would have essentially, your entire, tuition, your meal, your board covered. Outside of, I believe it's, you have to contribute something as a student, so you'd have to work, a set number of hours on campus to contribute. But, again, they want to make sure that your $90,000, bill is completely covered because, your finances will not be the reason why you cannot apply here. If your family makes $100 billion a year, you're going to be paying $90,000 a year to apply. And so again, it works out on both ends. So those that can afford it are paying, and those that can't are, getting it subsidized. Dartmouth has billions of dollars in their endowment, which, B, billion with the B, that cover, that financial aid for the students here. And so, again, it's one of the things that I love about Dartmouth is that, financially, you are not going to, be kept away because, potentially you could not afford it here. And so the way it works, if you make more than $125,000, everything is just on a scale at that point, and so, if you make between X and X amount, you would pay, such and such. And so there's a pretty good calculator on the website that you can go on to kind of look at, based on my family's financials, what would that look like for me, as a student there. But as I said, Dartmouth is one of the few Ivy League schools that is needs blind international, and so uh, what that means is that when you're applying, they're going to admit you or deny you based on merit, and then they're going to look at what your finances would be. If we weren't needs blind international, which other Ivies aren't, right? They would first look and say, okay, well, how much would it cost for us to get this kid here? And they would have to make sure that made sense first. Whereas Dartmouth will say, if you're the right fit, well, we're going to find a way to get you here.
What a wonderful thing to have that not be such a burden to bear. We were talking a little bit, or we were going to talk a little bit about the women's team. Could you tell us about the women's team and how it operates at Dartmouth?
Yeah, I guess Melanie, give me a little bit more, I guess, clarity on what you're asking.
Well, within the men's team, you have this varsity team, and the women's team, I'm sorry, the men's team is a club team, the women's team is a varsity team. I get that they've got slots per se, but do they have three teams like the men's side? Do they have as much history at the school, or is it a newer program? I'm just trying to get a little bit more color.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I should know all this, and I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know it at all here. But Dartmouth used to be a male only school. In fact, I think, I'm not sure how many of the Ivies, but it did, and up to, what year I'm not actually sure, but I believe it was the 70s of the that all, got I guess co-ed. And so they don't have as long of a history. And so I believe they went varsity in the early 2010s. But they were a club prior to that, but the second they've gone varsity, and I'm sure even when they were a club team, they have been nationally ranked and extremely successful, from the get-go here. So they're because they are varsity, it means that they have recruited slots. How many of those each year they get, I'm unaware. But it means that they don't have, 80 players, as many walk-ons as the men's club side does. So their roster, again, if I were just to speculate, is around 35. So they have the depth that they need to compete, but they really put forward, one very competitive team on game day each week here. They also, similar to the men, they play fall 15s, autumn 15s, and spring sevens as well. They just got back from a training trip ahead of their sevens season this year where they went to Fiji. And so some really cool opportunities for them as well. And so they're an incredible program, and anybody that would be so fortunate and blessed to be part of that program. Again, they're just great culture, and we enjoy being able to share Dartmouth rugby name with them.
That's great. I have a couple more questions. One is about alumni. And does Dartmouth Rugby have an alumni foundation that is supporting the program or is involved with the students in any capacity?
Yeah, no, the alumni, both the Dartmouth alumni as well as the Dartmouth rugby alumni are incredibly loyal and fierce, and I think Dartmouth is one of, if not the smallest Ivy League, school. So, and it's also, as I mentioned, unique and where we, are located. And so the experience is, I think, unlike any other, which creates this, I guess, this camaraderie, this loyalty to the school, to the rugby program. So the rugby program does, there's 75 years of, alumni that have gone into it here. We have a board, that essentially, kind of governs the rugby program. And the majority of our funds that we spend are donated back through the alumni network, or the Friends of Dartmouth Rugby here. But while that's amazing for the 4 years that the young men are on campus, and giving them the top experience that they can have here, it's also incredible for when they graduate because of the network that they have, within the alumni network. And so a lot of the guys will use that network in order to get internships, to get jobs, so on and so forth here. And so it's one thing that I've just, continually blown away by is just how incredible the alumni network is. And I see that inside the rugby program, but just as a whole at Dartmouth, that they, everyone really, is making sure that everyone has the resources they need to be successful once they graduate.
Super, thank you. One last question. You mentioned earlier that with the other Ivies, they tend to be very close to or in big cities like Harvard and Boston, that sort of thing. What can you tell me about Hanover, New Hampshire, and that community that is around Dartmouth, as well as where you stand versus major cities?
Yeah. That's great. So we are located about 2 hours north of Boston. So we're not too far away. There's what's called the Dartmouth Coach, which on the hour, every hour, it basically has a shuttle to and from the city. So anytime the guys are inkling to get down to the city to watch, an NBA game, the Boston Celtics, so on and so forth, they'll just jump on the bus, and head down there. But it's a college town, which is amazing. Like everything in the town of Hanover revolves around Dartmouth, and so you can walk everywhere on campus. You don't need a car. You can have one if you'd like, but it's just a very small town where everything kind of revolves around, the campus life there. And so, Greek life is very big on campus, excuse me. So the sororities, fraternities, um, but it creates, I guess, just such a atmosphere where we typically don't see our players leaving to go down to the city, but we see a lot of the players, the other Ivies coming up to come visit us, for these weekends here. And so it's a different, I guess, unique experience here, but it's I think for the right individual, yeah, it's incredible because everything just, like I said, revolves around the city, the town there.
So if there is a rugby player that's watching this and they're thinking, hey, this sounds pretty good. I think I've got the academic chops for Dartmouth. What is their next step? How do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so the best thing, I mean, you can always just, find my email on the Dartmouth rugby.com website here. So, which would be great, send me an email. But there's also a recruiting form, on our website, which is the best place to start because by filling out that form, it gives us all, I guess, the information we need in order to make sure we have an educated discussion when we jump on a Zoom call here. So, once you fill out that form, what we would do is we'd set up a time to chat, similar to how you and I are chatting, Melanie, here. So we jump on a Zoom, and preferably it'd be with you and your parents, your family, as that's we know it's not just typically just one person that has to make some sacrifices and decisions that it's kind of a family decision there. And so and then we would talk about next steps, what and really our goal would be that you'd be able to come out to visit campus, if that's possible, because we want to make sure that you're able to see yourself living here for the next 4 years, that this is where you want to be. But prior to you coming to visit, there's obviously a lot of conversations that will probably happen before that to make sure you have all the information you need and say, hey, I could really see myself here, next step. Let me see if I can go visit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today and telling us all about your wonderful program and Dartmouth. And it makes me want to go back to school, but that's probably not in the cards. So thank you again. And I hope to get updates from you maybe in the fall season. And fingers crossed that it's a great season for you.
Yeah, appreciate it, Melanie. Thanks so much.